Alright, so I'm Daniel Garrett. Just did an introductory video on the new series I'm going to be starting, which is a chess study series working through like the Yusupov, Dvoretsky, and Jacob Agard books, and maybe a few others mixed in along the way. And this is going to be the first video, so again, disclaimer, I'm not going to offer any of the original content from the book, so like their own, in this case, Yusupov's comments, notes on like games and exercises, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through the exercises themselves and the games themselves, offering my analysis, and I'll encourage you on the exercises to pause the video. Ideally set up the position on the chessboard yourself. Try and work through the puzzles, write them down, write down the variations that you thought about, and then you can unpause the video and get my thoughts, and then of course I'll check it with the book or the engine, and I'll be able to say, oh, this was right or this wasn't right, and we can go from there. So for the orange books, I mentioned this in the introductory video, there's 3 of these books, and then there's a bonus book that he wrote, Revision and Exam, which actually offers 6 extra exercises for each chapter in the first 3 books. So we're going to kind of be working through these in tandem. There's 12 exercises plus, games or things like that before the exercises in each chapter, and then there's an extra 6 I'll work through here. And we're going to do that for each of the 24 chapters plus the final exam for each of the first 3 books, 4 books counting the revision book. Alright, so for the first one, we're going to be looking at mating motifs. And the very first one we're going to be looking at is mating along open lines. So I'm going to look at a game here. This is Lasker versus Meyer, and it's a Prague Simult game in 1900. Alright, so this was a position reached in Lasker versus Meyer, a Simult game. Lasker has white, and he finds a win here with the open line. So you'll notice that Black's king is very exposed. Material is actually better for Black. Black's up a pawn right now, and in fact this pawn looks somewhat threatening potentially. But White can actually just win by force. So anytime we're trying to analyze a chess position, the first thing we should look for are any tactics in the position, checks, captures, threats, active moves, things like that. And once we've exhausted that list, then we can move on to slower, more positional concepts. But we really shouldn't do that until we've exhausted that list. So the first thing here is you'll notice we have a check. So we should begin by calculating where that check could lead. So what we want to do is we want to do this without moving the pieces, because in a game, once you make a move, you can't take it back. So if it's not good, you're up a creek. So this is where we encourage you to pause the video, think about this yourself, write down what you think the variations are, and I'm going to give you a second to do that, and then I'm going to give you the answer here. Alright, so let's think about this here. We have rook d8 check. The king only has 3 options, right? He has to go king f, g, or h7. So he's going to have to go to one of these 3 squares. And then we could throw another check in with the other rook, right? To continue pushing that king forward. So we could do rook 1 to d7, 1 to d7 check. And at that point, the king is going to have to continue forward. So we know no matter which one of these squares he went to, he's going to end up having to go to one of these 2 squares. Our pawn conveniently covers these 2, right? So he's going to have to end up on f6 or h6 by force. Alright, now at that point, we can go ahead and rule one thing out really nicely. So if he goes to h6, we can just play rook h8, and that's checkmate. So I'm going to go ahead and move the pieces just to show you what that looks like if you're struggling with the visualization. Let's say the king goes over here. This is checkmate. He's in check. These squares are covered. And this is covered by the pawn. Alright, so let's back up a little bit here. Let's continue visualizing. So we know that if the king doesn't want to get checkmated right away, he must go to this square. It's forced, right? So rook d8 check. King somewhere on the 7th rank, rook 1 d7 check, king must go to f6. So we know we can force him to f6. Alright, so how do we continue making progress here? Well, we would love if we continue pushing him forward, but if we just continue checking him, he's just going to go back and forth, right? So the only way we're going to be able to push him forward is if we give him a check from a different route. So the way I can see that right away would be rook f8 check, right? So this rook is up here, this rook is here, the king is here. We can check this way, all right? Now remember, this square is covered. This square is covered. King can't step back because the rook. So we know we can force him to e5. All right. So the king's going to be at e5. Now, how do we continue forcing him forward? All right. Well, we don't really want to allow him to start running. So we probably don't want to do anything with the rook that's right here, right? Right. We can't check from here. That would just be silly. And if we check from here, the king's going to start running. So we know we have to continue using this rook. All right. Well, the only check we have with that rook is right here. e8. All right, so rook e8 check. Now the first thing is, okay, what if he just goes back? Now we'll notice a difference though, because in the previous position our two rooks were here, and the king when the king was here. Now our two rooks are here, and this makes a difference because we have a new check, and that's rook to e6, and that's actually checkmate. So we know the king can't go back. All right, so we've checked here, we know the king now has to go to f4. Alright, so it feels like we're probably making some progress here. Okay, once again, we only have one check to make sense. Checking here, he just takes our rook, so let's try rook e4 check. Okay? We know then the king has to step here because these two files are still cut off by our rooks. Alright, so we force the king all the way to g3. And now at this point, it's pretty easy. We can see that we have king to e3, and that's checkmate because our king is covering these squares, rook's covering these squares, and this rook is covering these squares. Alright, so now we can go ahead and play that out. And this is how you should calculate it in a game, right? You want to see this ideally before you make all the moves, because if for some reason this didn't work and the king was getting out, maybe this is still the best plan, but maybe it's not, because now our rooks might be in a position we don't need them to be in, just depending on the, this alternate situation. So you always want to calculate it out first. Alright. Check, here, check, here, check, here, and checkmate. Alright, so this is an example of checkmates along open lines. In this case, with rooks, and typically along open lines it's going to be with rooks or queens or both. So we're going to use another example here. This is a game from Yusupov and Schlosser in 1997. Alright, so it looks like I've got the position set up now. It's white to move here. And what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to find the best move. So the first thing I would say is, again, we're evaluating the position. Do we have any checks, captures, threats? Or inactive moves. So as far as checks go, we really only have one of these checks. And this one doesn't seem to accomplish a whole lot because the king can just shuffle, right? So we'd have to still get another piece involved. This check, possibly. But I don't think that we really care about material here, right? Because the king is so exposed, if, we should be getting some sort of checkmate attack. King safety is extremely important, and it trumps material because the game ends with checkmate. So maybe this check, but that would just be a candidate move because this does allow the king more squares. I'm sure we're still fine afterwards, but instead, what really jumps out to me is this rook lift. And the reason this jumps out to me is because we're threatening a ladder mate. Check. Okay, well, he could go here, but then there's this mate. If he goes... Well, in fact, he has to go there, actually, because that's covered. But anyway, yeah, just this rook lift. And it's not a check. It's not a capture, but it is a threat. So it's that third thing on that criteria. We're threatening just, mate and... like mate and two, or... and there doesn't seem to be any kind of defense. Black could throw in some temporary block, but we're gonna win that queen if he does. He could try and do like this, but again, we're gonna be able to checkmate him, and so I'll show you that line. Here, if rook tries to go there, blocking, we just take it, so he has to try this. And easy enough. Oops. Whoops. I forgot I'm still in the board editor, so, okay. Yeah, so check here, the king has to step back, and then here, and then, you know, either one, right? Yeah, so this just looks like a force mate, after rook e5. And, sorry, this rook was here. Not that it matters. And yeah, so rook e5 and mate in a few moves depending on the variation. That's and that's it. So pretty easy there. And some of these are easy, because especially these first few, because we're just getting like the examples of what the lesson is about, and then we'll have the exercises. All right, so I'm going to set up another one here. This one is going to be on Anastasia's mate. So here we have, it's actually black to move. And we're looking for Anastasia's mate. So Anastasia's mate is a famous type of mate, but even if we didn't know that, if you just have this in the game, you don't have to know the names of the mates. You want to look for those checks, captures, threats. So I'll let you pause the video here. I should let you pause in the last one, but pause the video, look for any checks, captures, threats, active moves, and you always want to look down the whole line, right? So like, okay, I do this, he does that. I do this, he does that, right? And go all the way to the end until there's no more of those active moves, right? Because a lot of times I find when people are calculating, they tend to truncate their analysis. So I'll give you a few moments here. All right, so obviously the first thing we have is, gosh, I forgot I had that on. There we go. First thing we have here is this this check, right? So if we check there with the knight, we know that the king has to go to the corner, right? That's the only option, right? He has to go to h1. So we have knight check, king h1, and then the next thing that jumps out at me is that knight moved, and now the queen is hitting h2, right? So, okay. Giving up our queen could be bad. This is, again, why we have to calculate before we make the moves. But what happens if I take the pawn on h2 with my queen? Okay, so obviously the king has to take. And what that also then brings to mind is, oh hey, now the knight's out of the way, the pawn's out of the way, I have another new check. I have rook h4 check. And then when we look at that, we actually realize that rook h4 is checkmate, because the knight is covering g1, and it's covering g3. And the rook is covering all the h-file. Alright, so once we calculate checkmate, we don't have to calculate anything else. We know that has to be it. And there we go. That's checkmate. All these squares are covered. Alright, let's set up another position here. Perfect. Okay. So this is black to move again. And I do have the position set up correctly. And I'm going to give you a chance to pause the video. Alright, so looking at this here, we have, we definitely have some active moves. First thing I would say is we have a couple checks. So queen taking here, I don't see anything after queen takes or knight takes, you know. Queen here, same thing. I think the king can just take, and there's not really anything there. But we do have a couple knight checks as well. This one, after the pawn takes, I don't really see a whole lot. It doesn't really open up the king much, and it's actually hitting this rook here with the pawn. But we also have this knight check. And that knight is, it's actually safe there, right? Because the queen can't take, we would just take the queen with the rook. So knight check, and that again actually only leaves this h1 square, because this one is covered by the queen. So we have knight e2 check, king h1. And here is where, this might be harder to find, but again we have to look for those checks, captures, and threats, right? So if we remember the previous positions, this is where building up those kind of building blocks of patterns in your head can really help you. If you remember that previous position we just looked at, we were able to deliver a checkmate with a rook on the h-file, because the knight was covering these squares. Here, we could do that, but we would have to get this pawn out of the way. So then the first thing to think of is there a way that we can try and get that pawn out of the way? Well, currently that pawn is defending this knight. So if that pawn, if you think about it this way, there's a concept called overworked pieces. If that pawn is obligated to stay on this file so that white doesn't get checkmated, it also cannot, at the same time, defend this knight, because if we take the knight and the pawn takes, then that pawn is no longer on the h file. So that's an overworked piece, right? All right, so let's look at that. So knight check, king h1, queen takes knight. Now it's a scary looking move. You wanna calculate that before you play it in your game. But queen takes knight, unless they just want to give us a free piece, which we'd be happy to do that, and then move our queen away. White has to take the queen then. All right, so white takes the queen. Well, we'd love to get a rook to the h file, but this pawn is blocking this rook, and it's covering that square from that rook. But a hint here is that we only need one rook. We only need one rook to get to the h file. And again, the pawn is overworked. So this is a very, very cool position. This is from an actual game. It's from Gast versus Bend in 1987. And oh, I'm sorry, no, that was the previous position. This is from Kamyshev versus Sokolsky. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. Leningrad, 1936. That's what this one's from. But we only need one rook, right? And the pawn is overworked. The pawn has to stay here to block this rook from getting the h file, and the pawn has to stay here to block this rook from getting here. So what if we just give one of the rooks up? Rook h5 check, right? The pawn must take. In this case, it's not a question of whether it wants to or not. It must. And then after, so now we've sacrificed our queen. We've sacrificed a rook. But now finally we get this rook check in, and it's checkmate. All right, so let's actually play that out. So knight check, king here. Now of course white could give up the queen here, or better for white is once we take this knight to just not take. But black's still winning. Black's gonna win quickly. So pawn takes queen, rook check, pawn takes rook, and then checkmate. And again, this is Anastasia's mate. It was just a much fancier version. All right, so I'm gonna set up another position here. This one is on the Arabian mate. And I think I am good. Yes, okay. So it's black to move here. And this one is a bit trickier. You pretty well have to already know the Arabian mate's pattern to be able to get this. But that's why we're doing these. So this one, I'm going to give you a chance to pause. You can figure it out yourself. If you still look at the checks, captures, and threats, you might be able to work this out. But what I'll do to give you a hint is that the knight and rook can work really well when the king is in the corner. The knight covering the rook and the rook delivering checkmate, and the knight in some cases covering the other escape square. So with that hint, I'll let you pause the video, see if you can figure this out. Alright, so the first thing to look at is, checks. We don't really have anything except for this, but then, okay, we just gave up our rook, and what is there? Captures, well, we looked at that capture, but we have one other capture, and that's this one. Now this one's very interesting because, okay, we're giving up an exchange, rook takes knight, pawn takes rook, but you'll notice that also opens up some sort of discovered check, because now that pawn is not shielding the king from any checks if we move this knight somewhere. So this is definitely a line we want to explore. Alright, so rook takes knight, pawn takes, and this is where we have to figure out, okay, where do we want our knight? So let's just imagine the knight's not here for a moment. Where will the king go when he's checked? Okay, well, he could block with the rook, so we have to consider that. But we also have to consider where the king could move to. He can't step up, pawn's in the way, can't stay on this rank, so he would have to go here, right? So if we take, pawn takes, knight goes somewhere, either the king has to go here or he has to block, alright? And that helps us then figure out where we want our knight to go. Because if the rook blocks, the king is still here. If we could hop back to this square, it would be with check, right? And that's going to force the king back. And then we could even go check here. Rook would block, rook takes rook, checkmate, right? Or if the king goes here, then if we could put our rook here and it be protected by the knight, it would be checkmate, right? Realizing that, in both cases, we want our knight on this square, all right? So, where do we put our knight so that he can get to that square? Well, there's two options. There's this one and there's this one. This one doesn't help us as much because the king can take the knight, and that gives him a square to get out, right? Whereas this one, he can't take our knight there because he'll be in check, and then we can move here. All right, so that now we have our answer. I know that might have been a little bit complicated, but we had to kind of like reverse think about where is our opponent going to go, then where would we like our pieces to be optimally. All right, so rook takes knight, pawn takes, knight discovered check, and there's two options for white. We can look at both of them, but we just calculated it. King here, knight takes, and you might be like, well, wait a second, this isn't with check. White can do something. That's true. That is true, but there's nothing he can do to stop this. Because we already looked at the other line where the rook goes here. Just getting checkmated, right? And if he doesn't do that, where else is he going to go? The rook can't come down here. We're just going to take it, right? Any kind of spite checks don't really matter. We just move our king. Now this is where in a game you would have to calculate, right? Because let's say we had a pawn here. And you're like, oh, I'm checkmating them. Well, they have a move here, and you could get yourself checkmated with a back rank mate, right? So you always have to calculate all the way through the line. But as soon as we see we have this left and that there's nothing to fear here, if we can see white has nothing he can do, we're just going to deliver checkmate. No matter what he does, right? He can make any move, mate's going to be coming in one or a couple moves after spite checks. And alternatively, if instead of... let me put this back. This rook was here. If instead of moving the king, he blocks, as we looked at, this comes with check then. And so then it's just very easy. Alright, so this is an Arabian mate. An Arabian mate's where, again, we have a rook delivering checkmate on one of these squares. You know, it could be any corner. Knight's covering it and covering the escape square. And this was this happened in a game. This was in Casper versus Yusupov in 1999. Yusupov won with this. Alright, so let's set up another position here. Let's see. Bear with me just a moment while I set this up. Alright, so we've got our position here. I believe this is also an Arabian mate. This is actually a very famous one. This is Reiner versus Steinitz. Steinitz was obviously a world champion. This is black to move. So the Arabian mate is typically done with, or is considered an Arabian mate with a rook, but obviously you could imagine a queen could deliver that checkmate the same way. And that's kind of our hint here. So I'm going to give you, I'm going to pause, let you try and figure this out. But just a hint that you can use the queen or the rook to deliver that sort of Arabian mate. Alright, so with that hint, we see that our knight is actually already ideally placed, right? It's already on that square diagonally, 2 squares in the king, covering these squares where it can, covering these squares where it can defend either a rook or a queen, delivering that check, and then covering the escape square the other way if need be for checkmate. So similar to a puzzle we had a couple ago, well, remember that we only need one heavy piece, right? We don't need multiples, so that allows us the concept of being able to sacrifice pieces. So like in that position a couple ago where we sacrificed our queen, we sacrificed a rook, but then we still had one heavy piece left, a rook to deliver the checkmate. That's going to be our hint here. So that's going to allow us to find this move, queen h4. The idea being that we're threatening this checkmate, and the rook is overworked, because it's trying to cover this queen and stop this rook from coming in, right? So he can't take our queen. If he takes our queen, we get the checkmate we want, right? but now we're making another threat to take here. So, you know, white can try going here to cover both, but that rook is again overworked, because the knight does a good job of covering these squares, and both of them are threats, and the rook can't continue to save, to stop both. So we take here, and checkmate. Once you kind of know the themes, it becomes much easier, because you know what you're looking for ideally, and then you can look for ideas around that. So that was the famous game, Reiner Steinitz, 1860. So now we're going to look at queen-bishop battery checkmate, so give me a moment to set up a position here. Ross versus Torb Jørgensen, Stockholm, 1897. Anyway, so we can see where, you know, if this pawn wasn't in the way and if this knight wasn't covering this square, this would be checkmate, right? That's pretty easy. So with that, I'll let you pause the video. All right, so we have this one's actually fairly easy if you understand that concept that this knight must stay here to guard this. So we just push this pawn. We open up our battery, and we attack the knight at the same time. It takes care of both problems. The pawn's no longer in the way, and the knight that's just defending the square is attacked. And there's not a good answer here. White can move the knight, they get checkmated. White does something to cover the mate a different way, then we just take the knight and we're up a piece, and we should go on to win the game. So this is all we had to find here. It's just this pawn push, e4, and black wins. Alright, so let's set up another position. So looking at this, we've got, yeah, I've got everything set up right, I think. Oh, nope, not quite. How to, there we go. There we go, sorry about that. All right, we've got everything set up right. It's black to move. This is from, I think it's Garcelle versus Sosonko. I apologize, I'm slaughtering these names. It's from 1977. It's black to move, and again, it's the idea of having this queen-bishop battery. So you can see, again, we already have this battery set up. We're eyeing that same square where if this knight wasn't here, it would be checkmate. And that should give us a hint, because again, it's the same concept of overworked pieces, right? If something must do something, its options of doing something else are not there. So the first thing we'll see is, I guess I should say, I'll let you pause the video. Go ahead. All right. So the first thing that I would see, and hopefully you'll get to the point you can see if you haven't already, is that this knight cannot do any job protecting anything else, right? So like, for example, this can't do it. Another thing it can't do is cover that square, right? So like, this knight would love to come here and fork this queen and rook, like those kind of tactics we gotta be looking for, right? And the knight cannot protect that, right? Normally it would, but it can't, because checkmate. Now, there's a bishop here, but the bishop is also overworked, because the bishop's trying to help cover this knight and cover that square since this knight can't, right? See how the pieces work together? So bishop is overworked, knight is overworked, but you might be like, well, this knight's defended 3 times, this one, and this one. Well, it's actually not. It's only defended once, because this one has to cover here, this one has to cover here, so the only thing actually defending this knight is this pawn. So that should tell us, okay, what happens if I take this knight? Well, I know they have to take here. What's defending this bishop? Nothing, right? Because this knight's gone, we just took it, and the rook is now x-raying this bishop because the pawn must take and opens up the bishop. Alright, so then what happens if I take this bishop? You know, a move that moves my knight out of the way while taking something. How do they protect this bishop and take the knight back at the same time? Well, we just found our answer, right? So knight takes, pawn must take unless they want to hang this fork. Knight takes, and what do? Whatever they do, whether they take with the queen, the rook, the pawn, they're hanging this. And in fact, rather than giving up the piece, maybe they should go the other route where they give up the exchange instead, you know, allowing like that knight fork. But in any case, you can calculate through that, like this piece is overworked, it's not actually doing this job it looks like it's doing. That piece is overworked, it's not actually doing that job it looks like it's doing. So that means if I do this, they must do that. And if I do this, they must do that, right? That's how tactics work, and that's how, this wasn't super advanced, but that's how a little bit more advanced tactics are built, is you're breaking down these different building blocks. And so that was the answer. In the game, knight takes d4 was played, e takes d4 was actually played, and then knight takes c3. They took back with the rook, and then rook took on e2, and black obviously went on to win. In fact, might have even resigned. It's a little unclear. White might have resigned. Alright, so let's set up another position here. This is going to be on queen-rook battery. So we just looked at queen-bishop battery, now we're going to look at queen-rook battery. Alright, so I got the position set up. This is actually white to move. It's from Casanova versus Hull, London 1818. Alright, so I'll let you go ahead and pause here. Alright, so the first thing that I would be looking at in this position is, again, we're looking at those checks, captures, threats. And I would be noticing that this king, he doesn't have a lot of squares, right? All of this is covered. This rook is pinned to the king. We could take that rook, but I mean, I would be looking for checkmates because this king is so boxed in, and we have this nice open h-file. So like the first thing that jumps up to me is, what if we just play queen here? Because we're threatening checkmate on two different squares. And in fact, believe that's just the answer. Yeah, queen h2, there's no defense, white wins. Very easy puzzle once you see that idea. But this is an example of a queen-rook battery, because what we're going to do is we're going to threatening mate two different squares. This rook cannot move to let the king out because of this pin, so that's how this bishop is helping out. And anywhere this rook goes doesn't really matter. This is okay, this isn't checkmate right away, but this is checkmate in one. And in fact, we could even play check and then the king here and then check if we wanted to make it two moves instead of one for some reason. But there's no way, you can't even move this pawn, not that it would help because we're threatening checkmate on both squares, but it's just, king is super boxed in by his own pieces. Alright, so moving on, I'm going to set up another one for a queen-rook battery. Okay, so yeah, everything looks good, and it is white to move here. This is from Yusupov versus Rubinetti in 1982. And again, we're looking at queen-rook batteries. Yeah, so here, what I would notice is that if we take on this square, so like let's say bishop takes, or rook takes. Sorry, I should let you pause. I have to get used to doing that. I kind of already cheated a little bit here, but hopefully you paused. Alright, so if we take on the square and the rook takes, we're going to be able to take again, so because we got two pieces, right? And so what that's going to do is that's going to lure the king to here with no shelter, really, right? And then we can bring another rook over. And at that point, because this square is cut off, and this file is covered by that new rook, we know the king would have to hide there. So we can kind of visually see, all right, bishop takes pawn, rook takes, king takes, rook over check, king has to go over to h8, right? And then what I would notice is we have that same idea that we could play queen g4, threatening checkmate here, and potentially here if the rook moved up to try and cover that square, right? And he can't cover both mates. So that should be the answer. Interestingly, we should not go queen h6. You might think that's the same thing, but it's really not, because we're only threatening checkmate on one square, and the rook could cover this square, because we're not threatening checkmate there. So let's look at that. So bishop takes, rook takes, king takes, rook check, king here, and not here, because of rook to f6, but queen here, threatening it on two squares, because we're overworking the rook. That's the idea. Like, the rook can't cover both these squares at the same time. The only way it could do that is from here, but we would just take it, right? And then white wins. That's the end of the story. The game is over, because there's no way for the... Unfortunately, this pawn's in the way for the queen, and this rook can't cover both the squares, so white wins. And that's what happened in the game. Bishop takes, king takes, rook check, king h8, queen g4, and black resigns. Alright, so we're going to set up another one. This is on Bowden's mate. And this one's a very pretty one. Bowden's mate is a mate with two bishops, basically, is what it is. It's a very specific type of sacrificial checkmate. We'll see here in a moment, but alright. So this is from a game, Shoulder versus Bowden. It's black to move, as you could guess, hence the Bowden's mate. And yeah, I've got everything set up correctly. Alright, so the first thing we can see here, we'll pause the video. Alright, so we're going to look for those checks, captures, and threats, and active ideas, right? So we'll notice that the king is cut off, right? In fact, he actually has no legal moves. So if we could deliver a check to this king, that didn't involve giving the king some sort of an escape square, it would just be checkmate, because he doesn't have any moves, and that's what checkmate is. Alright, so what this can really do... Yeah, I was going to say, I know I messed something up here. This is where I need to... I'll let you pause the video now. That should be a big hint. That should be a big hint. I apologize about that. Okay. So now that we got the correct position here, it's the same thing though. We can see this king is cut off. If we could deliver some kind of check without giving him an escape square, it would be checkmate. And so we can see that if this bishop can magically get to here safely, like this pawn wasn't in the way, that would be checkmate, right? We can see a sacrificial idea. Queen takes pawn, pawn takes queen, because we don't need the queen to deliver checkmate. And then we can put our bishop here. But of course, our pawn is in the way, right? So this is where we actually have to realize that not every attack has to end in checkmate, and we can use underlying ideas to deliver other types of tactics, right? So if this bishop could get here, queen takes pawn would be a threat. So that's when we find this idea. This is where, sorry, I messed up the initial position, but hopefully we're able to pause again and figure it out with the hint that the bishop's here. We just play d5. And with d5, we're threatening the bishop, so we're just threatening to win a piece, and obviously that would be enough to go on and win the game. I also must have forgot white's queen somewhere. I am so sorry I messed up this position so badly. I'm so sorry. I'll have to work on maybe getting these positions set up beforehand so I don't do this, but part of setting up manually yourself. Anyway, queen here. Doesn't matter. We're threatening to take this bishop. We'll be up a piece. Should be enough to win the game. And if white takes it, which I think is what actually happened in the game. Let's go double check. Yeah, he actually took it in the game. Which is worse, you should just give up the piece. Then black got to deliver this beautiful checkmate. And this is called Bowden's mate, when you have this nice checkmate with two bishops like this after some sort of sacrifice. Okay, so I apologize that I messed up one of the puzzles here. I'll try to minimize how much that happens. Alright, so this is from a game Chalupnik versus Solos Hinkin. I am so sorry about these names. Maybe I'll even leave the names out. But it's a game from 1989. It's white to move. I'll let you pause the video. Alright, so this one is very hard. Don't necessarily expect you to have solved this. In fact, when I first worked through it, I found the first several moves, but I didn't find everything that came after, because this is actually a pretty difficult one. And I think the reason he included this is just to show you that these concepts, sometimes they're very easy, but sometimes they're very, very deep, but the underlying ideas apply. Alright, so the first idea is, let me unselect there. Okay, first idea is we can see that we have this whole Bowden's mate idea. So like if we play queen here and black just took, well, that would be checkmate, right? Of course, black doesn't have to take her queen though. But the other nice thing is we're actually literally just threatening now to take this pawn and then deliver checkmate. We're also threatening to take here and, you know, check and then gobble a bunch of stuff. Well, and that's actually checkmate, right? So a lot of threats with this move. Black has a fascinating idea to try and save the game. It doesn't save the game, but it makes it a lot more complicated. And I did, to my credit, see this move. It's queen c5. And the idea is that you're covering both these pawns. After queen c5, though, white has knight a4. So it's really funny. This actually this happened in a game. But, you know, white's queen is just hanging out this whole time. And it just can't really be taken because of this whole underlying Bowden's mate idea. So instead we're just trying to remove the defender, right? Queen's covering this pawn. We want to get in this way. It's also covering this pawn. So how does the queen stay on it? Well, it really can't. The only idea black has is this crazy looking move where black sacrifices the queen, saying, hey, I can get your queen back since your queen's been hanging this whole time. Alright, so queen e3 check. Bishop e3. And of course, black takes the queen. Now we can take this with check. So the nice thing is we've already picked up this pawn here, so that's, you know, a nice little bonus. King b8, so if the king steps up, then we have this Bowden's made idea again, right? Because after the bishop blocks, we just take, right? So king has to go here, and then knight to, oh my gosh. Knight to e5, there we go. With the threat of taking here, a fork, you know, just winning a bunch of material. King has to kind of come forward to protect that since we don't have this immediate mate. But after king e5, after king e7, then we have knight takes f7. And the reason we can throw this idea in is because that, again, that underlying threat of Bowden's mate, right? So they can't really take the knight, or we're just going to checkmate them. And after knight takes f7, this is actually where black resigned, but we could continue this because there's actually a little bit... this is a really deep problem. Because the bishop can take the knight here, with the idea being that black gives up the knight, right? So before he would just be down a piece, and it's like that's enough to resign. But here we sacrifice a piece, so he can sacrifice a piece back, right? So knight e5, and then after that we take the knight, and then best for black is actually to block with the rook, because we're threatening this. And then after he blocks with the rook, we take with our rook because we want to maintain this threat. And after black takes, we take here, and we're picking up this rook. And so we gobbled a bunch of pawns, and we're still getting material. Now this was a very deep problem. I don't expect everyone to solve this. I myself did not solve all of it. I saw the first few ideas, like the queen. I did actually see up to like queen e3 check and taking. I saw where I was getting at least the pawn and still had an attack. I did not see it all the way down to like bishop takes g7 here. But in a game, again, if you kind of see that underlying ideas of like the Bowden's mate in this case, or some of those other ideas of like Arabian mate, Anastasia's mate, the mate along open lines, the queen bishop battery, the queen rook battery, you're going to find sometimes very simple tactics, sometimes more complex tactics. And in fact, even in practical games, even if you don't play it completely accurately, don't let anyone tell you I said that, but sometimes you'll still get away with it because it can be very difficult to defend. So like, you know, in this case, like you may play here and they don't even find like this whole queen c5, queen e3 check, right? And you just win like right away. That said, obviously concrete, accurate calculation is best. But on a practical level, still seeing the ideas is good. All right, so I'm going to end the video here because this takes us through the introductory stuff, and then I'll move on to the exercises here in a separate video just because of video length.